Where there's instability and uncertainty, there's opportunity. That's the business approach. That's the organizational approach. That's the medical approach. As opposed to saying where there's uncertainty and instability, we need to manage that down to zero. No, those are the areas where science is going to really come to the fore and deliver us to a better place.
Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, I'm delighted to welcome retired Admiral Scott Swift to the Science of Leadership. Admiral Swift served as the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, leading approximately 250,000 personnel with about 200 ships and 2,000 aircraft, while overseeing one of the most strategically significant regions in the entire world. With decades of experience leading through complex and high-stakes situations, Admiral Swift has firsthand insights into how calculated risk can serve both personal and organizational success. We'll discuss the critical role calculated risk plays in accomplishing big goals, why leaders embrace it, and how we can reframe failure as a valuable teacher. You'll want to stay tuned for Admiral Swift's practical advice on how to embrace risk wisely in your own leadership journey. Admiral, thank you for joining me today on the Science of Leadership, and thank you for your service to our nation.
Well, thanks for having me, Tom. I look forward to joining your audience in this journey of learning leadership. I appreciate very much the invitation to participate.
Well, Admiral Swift, let's jump right into today's topic. As a fighter pilot and subsequent commander of the Pacific Fleet, you've been in plenty of situations that carried enormous risk. When you and I talked before, you said that leaders consolidate success by embracing risk. What did you mean by that?
I'm going to take a minute to answer this because I think this is a core question that organizations and individuals need to continually ask themselves. The context behind that statement is, in my experience in government, in serving in the Navy for a little over 40 years, and the 7 years since I've been in retirement, a common feature of successful organizations early in their development is embracing risk as a resource. This is most observable in startups, which I've been engaged with. I studied startups later in my career because I wanted to better understand their approach to risk. And now I'm involved with a couple of them since retiring. They embrace risk using descriptors like fail fast, fail early. Using fail in the same sentence twice as a positive is an example of divergence from what you see in many large organizations. They make statements like, we expect failure as an artifact of success, as an artifact of learning. It's baked into their culture. This does not mean fail for failure's success, but recognizing failure as part of the learning process. And if we believe that's true, which I do from experience and from my reading and observing others, if you want to be a fast learner, you have to be willing to accept risk as a resource to be managed along with all the other elements: revenue, capital resources, time, talent, all those other elements. As organizations grow in size, they tend to become more insular in protecting that growth, protecting that success. It is often monetized in the context of size of the workforce, floor space, locations, production rates. I mean, in your intro, you talked about the Pacific Fleet. I struggled with this as I talked to industry and organizations and individuals from the business community, from the commercial community, from the non-military communities, to put the Pacific Fleet in the same business context. I had 160,000 sailors that worked in Pacific Fleet, reported for duty every morning there. I had a $13 billion annual budget just for operating the fleet, not maintaining it, not paying salaries. So that's an example of the monetization in the context. And yet risk was an integral part of what we do in the military. And I think it's equally important in the commercial sectors. In those cases where, as organizations grow in size and become insular to risk becomes more of a liability than a commodity, something to be mitigated and minimized. This shift in an organizational's cultural characterization contributes to the challenges associated with growth, with sustaining those success rates. NASA versus SpaceX is an example that's current. There's discussion about commercializing the Postal Service. There's another example there. In the defense sector, it's Anduril and General Atomics being selected to develop and produce the unmanned collaborative combat aircraft, often referred to CCA for the Air Force and Navy, over the traditional primes, the traditional defense industry combat aircraft producers such as Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
NASA, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman all come from a background of cutting edge innovation, but have increased their focus on protecting what they have, reducing their tolerance of internalizing risk of the resource. It's analogous to how we consider risk in the context of our personal investments as we age, our risk tolerances, if you will. So, in that short descriptor, consolidate
Mhm.
success by embracing risk, we need to make sure we don't lose sight of risk as an enabler of that high velocity learning, which drives to that core foundation of continued success within an organization.
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. It's really a huge concept in a pretty concise statement, and I think that's when wisdom occurs. I think when you have a really big idea condensed into something pretty tightly like that. Um, as you were discussing this, I was thinking about in the field of medicine, we see this quite significantly. We over the last 100 years have made pretty significant strides in medicine, but then organizations have gotten to a certain place where now they've got to protect their reputations, their visibility, these sorts of things. And really, if you look, especially in my field of congenital heart disease and congenital heart surgery, I wrote a paper that we published a few years ago in Surgery. The journal's title is Surgery, where I talk about I believe that our field has reached its zenith, and now we're kind of going down because we were innovating and we were doing all these things to try to improve the care of children with congenital heart disease. And we got to a certain place where we were pretty successful, but then we stopped innovating in really significant ways because the gain, I guess, the potential gain was not that great or something. And so now we see this kind of tailing off. But anyway, so I was just thinking about that as you were talking. But I was wondering if you could share, from your own career, a specific story when you really took a risk like this.
Yeah, let me touch on two things, Tom, before I answer that direct question. Just that what you've triggered already. If it's triggered in my mind, it may be interesting to your audience. You talked about my response to your first question as reflection of wisdom, and I don't know if you meant it as my personal wisdom, but I want to disimbue you and the audience of any intellectual power that I have as an individual. I'm a lifelong learner because wasn't born smart, so I'm always interested in surrounding myself with people that are different from me. I suspect this is not part of the discussion today, but I think diversity is a critical element of any sustaining success within an organization. But when you talk about wisdom, I think it's really important to think in the context of organizational wisdom. It's really important as an individual to remain humble and understanding that the organization invariably has the potential to be smarter than any individual, and it's up to leadership to draw that organizational wisdom out. That's one point. The other point is I think that the embracing risk as a resource is consistent across all organizations, including the medical field. But I'll use an example. You touched on the medical element of it that I'm more comfortable and that is in the nuclear power piece of military power. So we use nuclear power to power our carriers. We used to do it with the
Mhm.
smaller ships, but it just wasn't cost effective. You cannot get it wrong in when you're dealing with nuclear power. So the precision associated with risk management is absolutely critical in those areas where the quantification of the value of embracing risk is difficult to do. So if you have not embraced risk and your organization failure, if your organization is not performing at the level that you want it to, it's very difficult as a leader to say, we need to take more risk. That is the wrong approach. That is the wrong approach. You have to understand what the gain is.
Mhm.
COVID may be an example. We might get to that point later. But in the environment of COVID, the medical industry took much greater risk with respect to resources that they were willing to invest within their company, their own personal company resources, combining that with government resources. I know you had Gus Perna, my friend General Gus
Yes,
Perna,
sir.
on a previous podcast. Look at what he did with supply chain. We brought a military expert into the White House to help reduce the friction within supply chains to make sure that once the vaccines were developed, and even the elements for vaccines were getting to the manufacturing site to speed the process up. But those are two things that triggered in your mind. It's not the question that you asked, but let me give you a specific story in my career where I took risk. The easy one is just flying jet fighters off of ships at sea. I mean, the concept is crazy. And yet the
Yes,
gain,
sir.
to the point that I made before, the gain in doing that was so great that the US Navy was willing to take steps to explore how to do that. And we did it as many companies do. You look at the ecosystem out there, and instead of becoming an innovator, you become an adopter. And it was actually the British that developed the steam catapult and the hydraulic resting gear system that the Navy took and integrated into its development of flying fighters off of aircraft carriers. So this is about the fast learning. We didn't want to fail our way along and go through all the failures that the British had gone through. We took what they had and then integrated it, modified it going forward. So this is about running fast with scissors. We have to run fast with scissors because our competitors are doing it. So if we become too risk adverse and saying, okay, we're never going to run fast with scissors because it's too high risk, but everybody else is doing it, so we're not going to be competitive. We're never going to fly aircraft off of ships at sea. Well, wait a minute. What is the gain in doing it? But let me give you another. So, I mean, the idea sounded insane to me when I first started flying, going through the training process. I thought this is crazy, but a little bit of peer pressure. Everybody else is doing it. I've got great trainers. They've showed me how it can be done. But I went from the science of understanding how we could do it to the art. And the
Mhm.
art is a mental game. So I think there is a blend of, I think you've got it exactly right. You have to have this, the foundational science right. And from that, there is a bit of subjectivity that comes into managing these things. That's the problem with, not a problem, but that's a concern with respect to the medical side, the nuclear side is it's really difficult to assess the advantage of embracing risk in certainly low return where you're not sure what the
Mhm.
return is going to be. So let me pause there and give you another more direct example. So later in my career, we were in the process of doing a upgrade to a missile system, and that upgrade had to do with a warhead. The missile itself had been in the fleet for 10 years. It was fully certified, gone through a rigorous test program, very little concern of failure. Now, failure can occur with the airframe, the whole electronic system, the flight system, the mechanics of flight controls, but the risk was very low. So the staff brought me a decision about approving a missile test on a range that a Navy range, a coastal range, and the missile was going to be shot out. It was a surface-to-air missile. It was going to be shot at a drone. And the reason normally that decision would be made at a much lower level. It was brought to me because there was a measure of risk associated with if the missile failed on launch, as it came off the launcher and all the controls went to their stops in one direction, it could conceivably get off the Navy range before it would be destructed, before the destruct button could be hit. Now, after 4 seconds of flight, there was no worry about that because there'd be plenty of time if that occurred. First of all, the range area was bigger, plus you'd have more time to destroy the missile. So I looked at this was the 10th in a series of warhead tests. All of the previous 9 tests had been successful. So I asked, well, what is the risk? Is it 1% risk, 2% risk? It was immeasurable. But the science said that there was some risk. They'd never seen this failure, but hypothetically it could occur, and that's why it was brought to me. So there was two things. One, I said the gain is way more than what the risk is associated. Do the missile test. And then I had a private discussion with my leadership to say, I want to better understand why that question was brought to me. I want to make sure that it was based on the fact that the ramifications, if there was a failure, this really required my leadership as the commander of the fleet to make this decision. If that what the reasoning is, that's fine. But if there's creeping risk aversion into the staff, we need to
Mhm.
understand that deeply. Maybe there's a good reason for it, but we need to understand that because we will cease being the fast learners that we have been throughout history and throughout my time on the staff to that point. So there's an example, two stories of an example in my career about taking risks, both as a young aviator learning to fly off of carriers, and as well as towards the end of my career making a risk decision with respect to testing a missile system.
Those are both great. Just the idea of someone, I think not necessarily, I mean, I've never done either, but launching off of a carrier is one thing, but to imagine trying to land on a carrier, especially at night, especially in roiling seas and all this sort of thing, that's just insane to me. But as you say, and right now, somewhere on this globe, a pilot is landing on the deck of an aircraft carrier for the United States Navy. So it's happening every day, all day practically. And they, I want to say we, but they can do it very well. But it just seems insane to me. So I appreciate that because that has been, as you say, instrumental in our naval superiority and our naval air power superiority. And without that risk, we wouldn't have that.
So, Tom, the broader context is it's a national security issue. So we have greater depth in national security because we fly naval aircraft off of ships at sea. It reduces our national security risk. It increases our capacity. That's the context that was viewed back in the early 40s, actually mid 30s, when we started exploring and experimenting with this. That's the decision process that leadership needs to make when these decisions are made between the cultural aversion to risk within the company. That's one process you have to deal with. But if you as a leader are individually risk adverse, it's very difficult for an organization to overcome that. So you have to
Yeah.
understand what the broader goal is, the value of attaining that goal is.
Mhm. Well, as you're sharing these things, and you touched on it a little bit, about the intersection of risk and learning, I think those are intimately related, but it seems to me that our risk tolerance does really say something about our willingness to learn. What would you say about, like, how interwoven are those in your mind?
I think there's a direct correlation. That's why I asked the question, the two questions I did when the risk of the missile test
Mhm.
was brought to me. I think there's a direct correlation between the two. If you're not tolerant of risk, you're not tolerant of what I describe. Others have done that. I've got a friend at MIT that has written volumes on this. You're not tolerant of high velocity learning. Learning for learning's sake is interesting, but within an organization, it has to be learning that brings value to the organization of whatever the organizational focus is. So I can be really fast running in circles, mainly because I'm really good at it. But if you give me a vector, if you give me a sector of interest or a sector to focus in, and this comes from my experience, I am not an expert at anything, but I have a lot of practical experience. And now that I'm retired, I use that in my consulting to consult with businesses that struggle with this issue of success and excellence. So I bring a practitioner's view to those problems, much as you. I mean, when you were a student of medicine, you were learning from others, but now I'm sure you're still a student with all the learning that you're doing. But as a practitioner, you're getting practical experience as well. So
Mhm.
now you can be a teacher, and I know you're a professor as well. This is the example that I use as a practitioner, and having that vector gives you that high velocity learning, learning with a purpose, learning with furthering the ideals and focus of an organization. And without that high velocity learning, you're not going to be competitive in a field of high velocity learners. I brought up the example of Anduril and General Atomics. They are disruptors in the defense field. And the primes in the defense manufacturing field are thinking deeply about how they can be competitive. And a lot of it is about getting back to their roots of embracing risk. And as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't mean risk management is not important. In fact, I would say risk management is more critical in a risk tolerant organization than in a risk adverse organization, because you don't want to learn just by failing, but you want to accept failure as something that is integral to learning in constructive way. The entire organization needs to be aware and empowered to unacceptable failures, such as catastrophic failure, repeated failure without mitigation.
Mhm.
Learning from failures that do not add to organizational value, and the list goes on. Failure needs to be embraced, but it needs to be controlled. And some of the best examples you've brought up already is medicine. And look at how that changed with COVID response, as we touched on
Mhm.
before, because the risk was so high already. The tolerance of increased risk, of increasing the velocity of getting a vaccine out there, even though, in my opinion, it was very low risk with the science that's associated with developing those vaccines. But it's a relevant example to consider as a case study, reflecting on risk tolerance as a reflection of our willingness to learn.
Yeah, as you were discussing that, the kind of thing that was going off in my mind is, also as leaders, we have to be, and this is part of the risk. There's the risk of some endeavor, and we have to be prepared to accept that. But there's also the risk as leaders to let our people have the opportunity to fail, to make a mistake and not crucify them because of it and castigate them and throw them out, but to see that as they're learning, we're learning. So as leaders, we kind of, I think, I love your thought on this. We have to take two risks in that sense. We have to be willing to have this operation, or whatever it may be, fail, but we have to also be willing to take the risk that this person that we have empowered has the opportunity to fail, and to stand by them, and to try to help them if that were to be the case.
That is a great point. I'm glad that we have 4 hours in this podcast to fully cover that question. So I want to make sure that your audience understands that this is a wave top approach to my response.
Sure.
You can't fire your way to success. Uh,
Mm,
my personal view is that the Navy as an organization is too risk adverse. If there's a character flaw, if there's a clear violation of safety protocols, those are reasons to step in and do an in-depth assessment and saying, how do we fix this? And if there's an individual that has had multiple failures, or you come to a consensus that that individual just that is going to carry too much risk in their process of embracing risk as a resource, then it may be time to ask them to depart the organization. But in my opinion, I think we reach for that tool in our leadership toolbox too willingly, too
mm.
quickly. And that others see that want to get promoted, that as a measure of success, they want to be successful within the organization, and then they retract. They don't share their ideas. They don't
Mhm.
share. Well, wait a minute. They don't talk about the black swans and blind spots out there. That's a free benefit of embracing risk as a resource. Because I've got barriers. I'm a white male that grew up in Southern California. Did not go to the Naval Academy. Flew aircraft off of aircraft carriers. Now we're both white males. We both got perfect heads.
Right.
Grow a mustache, and you would be perfect. If we surround ourselves with people that are just like us, Tom, there's a world out there that we don't see. But I know
Mhm.
you're different than I am because you're a doctor. That
Yeah.
I know from your education and what you've done, there is diversity between the two of us. We need to embrace that diversity because I need to empower you to speak up, to tell me
Mhm.
where you see risk or opportunity where I don't. Those are black swans and blind spots to me.
Yeah.
Likewise, there may be black swans and blind spots that you have that I can help highlight, and together we become better. We become better as an organization. So I think we need to be very careful about how we treat risk failures. You can't
Yeah.
we can't fail just for the value of failing, for the sake of failing. We have to understand what that value is. And if individuals have a hard time managing that, then we need to better understand it. Let me close on this point to this
Mhm.
question. We tell people you need to think out of the box. I'm sure you've heard that before.
Yes, sir.
And it's usually in a context of innovation that we're being outperformed by another organization. We need to do better, whether it's a university, whether it's a company, whatever it may be. We need to think out of the box. My response to that in the work that I do with leadership is, as the leader, you need to make the box bigger. The reason they're not thinking out of the box is because there is risk associated with thinking out of the box, or they're not fully educated, they're not trained.
Mhm.
There are resources that are not being applied, which is why they've set a cultural box to think within. So you need to make that box bigger. And the way you make that box bigger, in my mind, there are multiple ways to do it, but I think the most consequential way as the leader to say, I now make this box 10% bigger. That risk associated with doing that is my risk. I own
Mhm.
that as the leader. Let's get into that space and discover what the opportunities are there. So I think you're exactly right. This cultural risk aversion, and individuals being unwilling to embrace risk, we have to ask ourselves the question why. And many times it's because the actions an organization takes in response that those are part of the organization that experience failure.
Yeah, I think there's so much that we could learn as leaders just in contemplating that and recognizing our role in it. As I was preparing for our conversation and thinking about taking risk and calculated risks and things of that nature, I think maybe the most common example among our listeners is putting money in the stock market. There's there is obviously risk with that, and specifically with regard to retirement planning. I mean, I can tell you, I've watched my 401k take enormous swings over the last decade, not necessarily in my favor, but I've seen that happen. And so when we decide to buy, a stock or to put money into that retirement plan, we're taking a risk. We may not necessarily think about it, but we're taking a risk. While the market has historically gone up over time, I mean, companies fail, markets crash, these things happen, and we're assuming some degree of risk by putting our money into that, but also stand a chance to get a lot of gain from it. And so I was thinking about this, and Nvidia has just been exploding as a company, and their stock has just been going up through the roof. And so I decided to look back, and I was disappointed in myself when I did. But I, I discovered that 10 years ago, if I would have invested $1,000 10 years ago, which I didn't necessarily have that laying around at that point in my career, but if I would have done that, I would have over $250,000 right now from $1,000 investment. That was a big risk. They could have gone belly up. I lost my $1,000, which again at that time was a significant risk financially for us. But now I'd be sitting on a quarter of a million, and so it's that sort of idea that risk comes with the potential usually for significant gains, and if it doesn't, then it's not a risk that we should be entertaining. At least that's my as I think about it.
Yeah, so maybe I should explore financial planning because I have a rich history of experience of what not to do. Maybe not learning from from my failures. Although, I think your point is exactly right. I mean, look at the stock market just yesterday on a decision by the Fed or a comment by the Fed that there may be fewer reductions in interest rates next year than was anticipated. So you got to be careful about the near term piece as well. This also goes to the point of being able to, after an event, assessing of should we have taken more risk. We are, I don't know if we're a generational difference in age, but certainly there is a cultural difference. I use Apple as the example. Oh my Lord, if I had invested in Apple,
Sure. Yeah.
I'd be a multimillionaire by now if I'd put $5 into it.
Yeah.
But to the point, I think this is an opportunity to tease out an important point about managing risk. And my parents were products of the Depression. They were very financially conservative, which is to say they were risk adverse.
Mhm.
Uh, Now they were lucky. Luck is not a metric of risk management. You don't want to rely on luck. If you're a publicly held company, there's
Mhm.
fiduciary issues that are involved with that. If you're privately held, you may have some venture capitalists or people that are investing money and are have an expectation of what that return is. And so you have, I think, moral responsibility if nothing else. So I'm in my mid 60s. I took much more risk financially when I was younger, so I was very different from my parents in that way. I wasn't a product of the Depression. I had a lot of lessons from them, from their concerns about failure, about how to manage money. We generally bought a home every time we moved in the military, and I don't think we were in one place for more than 3 years. So we've bought and sold many homes. My first experience in tour duty in Washington D.C., we bought a home in Falls Church that was in the early 2000s, and we bought it on an interest-only loan because that's all we could afford. We knew it was high risk, but the sense is that we were going to move after 3 years, and certainly looking out at the market, that seemed like a reasonable risk. And potentially retire out of the Navy. I was at the 20-year point, and we would refinance it. We would be good. So we bought the home. Well, spin the clock forward. It comes time to transfer, and the market crashes. And we had a great realtor, and so we had done some upgrades to the home. So we marketed, been in the house for about a year and a half. We marketed it for $150,000 more than what we paid for it to pay for the renovations and whatnot. Even if we broke even, we were happy with that. And after 3 weeks, we were having several discussions with the realtor, and she was saying, "Well, let's see what the market does." I was looking at other things. Long story short, we ended up knocking. I didn't know where the market was, and I wasn't confident anybody else did. We were knocking $10,000 off the price of the home every week. And the caution was people are going to see how fast it's coming down and they're going to view you as desperate. This was financial reality with me. We
Yeah.
needed to load shed this thing. It was going to be an
Mhm.
albatross around our neck. Now we ended up selling it for $75,000 less than what we had originally put it on the market for, but the risk was gone and we still walked away breaking even. So this
Mhm.
comes to the context of that was a case where the risk was much higher at marketing it, putting it on the market where we did than what we realized. Now, with my portfolio now, I'm very low risk for the finances of what we need to live on comfortably. But I've got high risk assets as well. But that I don't risk what is important for me and my family. There's another set of assets out there that we continue to carry in high risk. So this balance of risk, it's not don't be risky in everything that you do,
Sure.
but in those areas where your organization needs to continue to lead and learn forward, those are areas where you need to take risk. And I think the key conversation is, hey, boss, I think there is an opportunity here, but we don't recommend we take advantage of it because it's high risk. Tell me about the risk. That may be risk that we have to invest in because of the gain or because of what the competition is doing. So I think that personal finance discussion is very useful, to put this discussion of risk tolerance and risk management, embracing risk as a resource, into a context that your audience can understand.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And just so the risk discussion, but there was something that you hit on there that I just want folks out there to understand is that with the time that you spend in the military, this was something that came up often when I was interviewing all the 4 stars. The number of times that you all have to move, and it ranges usually from maybe high teens to I forget 30 something was probably the highest that I heard. Just so imagine if you were married and trying to keep a spouse happy when you've got to move 30 times in a span of maybe 36 years or 40 years or something. It's just sort of that in itself is risk. But
Yeah, it's a challenge for sure.
well, it's easy, I think, for us to sit and kind of talk about risk and the need to take it. But if we look at studies, it really goes against our natural inclinations. And so, as humans, we tend to be pretty risk averse. And so, folks may be familiar with the work of Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. They published a paper in 1981, and they show that we tend to prefer a certain that is sure to happen thing, though potentially less desirable outcome over an uncertain but potentially better outcome. And so, as I've thought about that, I it's sort of like saying we prefer the devil we know over the potential angel we don't know. Any thought on that?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly right. The battery test that I went through, I did not go to the Naval Academy. I went to San Diego State University, but decided early on that I wanted to go into aviation, and came from a middle class family, and so I had a sense of urgency. I didn't want to go through the process of getting my certificates, and plus it was difficult from a financial perspective. So decided to join one of the services, and obviously ended up in the Navy. We went through a series of psychological tests that made no sense to me. I think probably by design. There were questions like, would you rather throw up on a crowded bus, or smash your thumb with a hammer? And it's I mean, there was some logic behind that. It was one of thousands of questions. I mean, it was a week
Sure.
long series of tests. I'm a little suspicious they were looking for somebody agonizing over that question, saying, "Oh God, I'd love to do both," and thinking, "Okay, there's one we can take." But a lot of it goes back to that mental ability to manage risk that is not yours to decide to take. Landing on aircraft carriers, SEAL
Mhm,
teams is an example.
mhm,
Driving surface ships at sea. I mean, this is the same with all the services. These are the police department. These are high risk police officers. These are high risk environments. So that there is the folks that get to become naval aviators. I mean, it comes from a very select group just through the testing process, the psychological testing process. And I think a lot of it goes right to this question about, as humans, we tend to be risk adverse, very concerned about mishap rates in the Navy. So this isn't people that just dismiss risk. I'm not worried about it. I'm going to do crazy things. I am much more risk tolerant than my wife is. It's not because she's a woman. It's not because of, being a mother. It's none of those things. This is just part of the communities that we were raised in,
mhm,
mainly on my side from my parents. So it's different for everybody. But there is some science related to this. Humans do tend to be risk adverse. There is a reason it's difficult with some car rental agencies to rent a car if you're younger than 25. And if you are going to rent a car and you're younger than 25, if they're willing to do that, you're going to pay a higher premium. And it's because of the development of it. As I say, I'm not an expert in anything. I'm going to go down a medical rat hole here with a doctor in front of me. And that is because of the prefrontal cortex development. It's not fully developed until you're 25, which is where the brain conducts cognitive functions, complex ones like decision making, consequence assessments, and et cetera. And all those are needed to fully assess risk. And the rental car companies understand this and say there's a higher risk of accidents from a science perspective by anyone that's younger than 25. Now, it's not a hard, fast line. Your life experiences, you may be much more developed than someone else that's younger than 25.
mhm,
But I do think that this is baked into us as human. No one wants to smash their hand with a hammer or throw up on a crowded bus. I'm not suggesting that you go do that, but I'm back to the comment that I made earlier about when you're presented, you want to make sure as a leader that you're presented by opportunities that subordinates or the staffs may have rejected, and understand why. It's why they brought that question to me about that missile test. I wanted to know the why
mhm,
behind it to make sure that we were remaining whole as an organization in our ability to learn about a world that's constantly changing around us. Where there's instability and uncertainty, there's opportunity. That's the business approach. That's the organizational approach. That's the medical approach. As opposed to saying where there's uncertainty and instability, we need to manage that down to zero. No, those are the areas where science is going to really come to the fore and deliver us to a better place.
In thinking about this, I often will ask guests for, an example where they really nailed it with regard to the topic, and then usually, I will, if I have an opportunity, I'll share a place where I've totally screwed this up. But given the complexity of this idea, I was wondering if you've got a and you've given this so much thought, I was wondering if you have a point in your career that you can look back on and say that you had the opportunity to embrace risk, and I guess I shared that with NVIDIA to some degree, but because you didn't, it actually turned out negatively?
Yeah, so here's the challenge, I think, in this. I think because my initial response is no. I've had plenty of failures in my career and in my life, but I hesitate to say it's because I haven't been as embracing in risk as I should have been. But I think it's because I touched on this earlier. I think it's because it's very hard to look back in hindsight and say I would have been more successful in that case if I had not been so risk adverse. Because you can't spin the clock back and say, and it's so subjective because you didn't take the action. You
Mhm,
didn't accept greater risk. It's very difficult in my mind. Maybe it can be done, but in my mind, it's very difficult to attribute a higher level of success if you had taken more organizational risk. Now, across the board, I think you can do that with multiple examples because now you have a data set that you can draw
Hmm.
on, especially if you can compare it to others in the industry or in other fields and saying, look at what we've done with vaccine development. I mean, there's two companies in the world that are extraordinary in being able to rapidly develop these vaccines. I was going to comment on this on the end in closing as I was thinking through the broader context of your podcast, and that is process is more important than product. So if you have a failure and you think that risk aversion may have been contributing to that, then I think you have to go back and look at the broader process. It's not this specific product. It's not that the lack of of investment in NVIDIA. In fact, Tom, you gave the answer. I didn't have the resources. So it wasn't that you were risk adverse. You couldn't afford to take $1,000 out of the rent and out of the food and all those other
Hmm.
things that you had going on. That's a huge risk. That's where I go back to this risk assessment is so important and people unwilling suddenly because they've monetized where they are, they've got so much value. I want to reduce my risk down. No, I'm comfortable living in the rest of my life with a portion of what I've set aside for retirement. But there's another portion that I want to continue to grow. That's an endowment for my children potentially.
Hmm.
So I think, yeah, I would say because it's very subjective. It's difficult to do, but I would say history is full of examples of failures, and historians go in and they tend to pick, military examples are the one that come to
Sure.
my mind, but where
Sure.
Eisenhower failed, where Eisenhower's successes, the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, it's still fresh in our minds. That it's useful to go back in history and ask ourselves, why did that happen? What could we have done differently? And I think risk should be part of that equation. But I can't look back at any specific decision that I made and said that failure occurred because I miscalculated the risk. I should have
Yeah.
taken more risk.
Well, I think that's, I appreciate that uh, cognitive honesty. I think that it is, as you say, it's hard for us to recall. And as you mentioned, there are data sets and people have, Blockbuster comes to mind in this thing. But one example that came to my mind, most people may not know, and so I thought I would share, is that General Motors actually introduced the first mass-produced electric vehicle. They call it the EV1, and that was back in 1996. But because they really didn't sell well, and if you go back and look at pictures, you may be able to discern why. But GM determined that EVs really occupied an unprofitable niche, and they stopped production in 1999. And that was just 4 years before Tesla Motors launched. And so Tesla focused exclusively on electric vehicles, and then in these ensuing basically 20 years since that time, Tesla has become the global leader, and with a market valuation as of the end of 2024 of $1.25 trillion. So along the way, embracing risk has led to tremendous learning, revolutionizing battery tech, and really what's possible for electric vehicles. So I think Tesla is a good example, really, of somebody that embraced risk to consolidate success. And the GM experience back in the 90s is a good example of a corporation that didn't, and now has this going on.
Yeah, it's a great point, Tom. I'm not the expert on this, so I'm really spitballing on this response. But I think there's an element here that's important. I think that the first question leaders need to ask is why. The next question they need to ask is how. And the last question they need to ask is what. We need to think strategically, plan operationally, and act tactically. Thinking strategically is the why question. Why are we having this problem? Whatever the problem is. The next question is how. How do we get after the problem broadly? So if you're talking from, my field of expertise is leadership and management, but also on national security. So how do we get after our national security? We tend to turn to the military every time, and we have all kinds of resources in the national security domain. That's a good example of the how. And
Mhm.
then the last thing is the what. And in the military, we tend to focus too much on crisis. This really started. I was frustrated that we don't think enough strategically. We don't plan enough. We call it operationally at that middle level. What are all the hows that we could get after the problem? We tend to go right to the what are we going to do? I think the what is the last question to ask. The what is made up of the hows. The hows are supportive of the why. Because if the organization understands why we're doing something, they're going to self-align behind it. This is an example, excellent example that you brought up. Look at the differences between. I think you said it was 96 that
Mhm. Yeah,
GM.
96.
Yeah, look at the cultural difference. Now look at the technology differences. I look at Elon Musk had just made a bunch of money. I think in eBay. I'm not sure where, but he had a bunch
Mhm.
of money. He
Yeah.
he convinced a bunch of venture capitalists that it was worth their money, 9 failures for every 10 success, that they invested a bunch of money. So he's well capitalized. They had an idea of the charging infrastructure that was needed. So this was about building an electric car that would be used for commuting, not for long distance. That's where my understanding of the original range designs were. There was increased environmental awareness. There was a young base of potential buyers that was really interested in tech, comfortable with it, comfortable with innovation. No buttons, no switches. That was a huge draw in of itself. So it was very different than 96. I mean, look at the ranges of the vehicle in 96. Look at the battery technology, the manufacturing technology. Not taking anything away from Elon Musk. He had to drive this to this success, be willing to embrace risk as a resource. But I do think that when we look back at those examples, we need to look at them in a positive context. What are the positives that we can draw? Why was Elon Musk so successful with Tesla? And why did GM decide not to go forward? But now look at the competition. It goes back to my example of landing and taking off from carriers. Navy didn't start with a clean whiteboard. They started off with what the British Navy had already experienced with. And I think now that the traditional primes, if you will, from car manufacturing have lifted an awful lot of what Tesla has learned and applied it to their own EV approach. Really interesting to see the divergence that most of them are going with plug-in hybrids or hybrids and not with strict EVs. I'm really interested to see where that goes. Oh, and look at government investment as well. I think California has a law that says they want to be all electric by 2035. I might not have that date exactly right, but it's close to that. Look at the incentives that the federal government applied with buying an electric car to
Mhm.
reduce the overhead costs. So you need to make sure that you're looking at when you're doing these assessments of embracing risk and learning from history as an example, which you've touched on several times, is very important. I do think that you need to make sure that you understand the context that you're dealing with it within your organization, both in the context of time, where you are currently from a cultural perspective, but also from a technology perspective.
Yeah, I think there's so many things to consider in there. Again, as you hit on this idea of risk aversion and so forth, and just to share some of the science before we jump finally to the kind of application, the practical on this. A lot of studies have looked into risk aversion. There are also studies that have shown the value that risk taking has on learning and success, and a number of studies have shown that taking calculated risk fosters innovation, resilience, and, as we've discussed, accelerated learning. And so Amy Edmondson is a professor at Harvard, and she has done studies that highlight the importance of psychological safety. And she's found that when team members feel safe taking risks without fear of punishment for making a mistake, which I kind of hit on earlier, organizational learning increases. And additionally, Carson DeDrew and Michael West found that teams willing to experiment and take calculated risk outperform those that play it safe. So the science really does support this idea that we're talking about, that calculated risks are really beneficial. Um, as we've been as we've been talking, I've been rolling this around some more in my head. And it seems to me that we're really talking about this kind of intersection of four things that we as leaders need to balance when it comes to the risk. And that's embracing the risk, the idea of organizational learning, ensuring safety, and then attaining operational success. And you kind of hit on the why, the how, the what. How do you strike this balance and the steps that you go through to really kind of get this calculus right?
Well, I think the first thing is to make sure you don't get it wrong. So a lot of times people say, how do we get better? A lot of times when I come into company, ask for my assistance, and they tell me what the problem is. I always ask for a day or two to spend some time with the organization. So the first thing is, what are the easy things to go fix? What are those things that you're doing wrong already? That's kind of what the conversation they want to have. But the conversation that needs to occur before that, what are those things that you're doing right to make sure you protect them? Because as you go through change, that is destabilizing in of itself. You want to make sure you don't change those things that actually are adding value, especially if they're adding low cost value to the organization. But I think those 4 points that you brought out are foundational to the process of uh, of high velocity learning. I think that's really what the key is. And where is risk an enabler to that, and where is risk a disabler? This is leadership work.
Mhm.
Um, Culture change is really, really difficult. There's another hour discussion on how difficult it is to manage culture. But whatever organization that you're a part of, whether it's your family, whether it's a unit within a division, whether it's a division within an organization, you have a culture specific to all three of those things. If you need to change that culture to maintain high velocity learning, to maintain cutting edge growth, uh, to maintain profitability within an organization, that is really, really hard to do. That's why it's leadership work. Leadership has to take that on as a challenge that they have to own. That is something that they can delegate elements of it, but they have to maintain ownership of that from the top. And that comes down to the necessity for culture change, and that is making the box bigger. is that
Mhm.
you need to tell people that we need to increase our risk tolerance. That doesn't mean just get out there and run fast with scissors. We have to run fast with scissors, but let's study how we can do that within the safety constraints. To your point, we don't want to injure people. We want to make sure what extra costs are associated with training people, then putting the mechanisms in place to run fast with scissors. So it has to be science based, but there is an awful lot of subjectivity that comes into it, the art part of it,
Mhm.
in making sure that you get this right. It's the Apollo uh, uh, moon missions. It's Apollo
Yeah.
13. Figuring out with the explosion that occurred,
Mhm.
how it is we're going to get them back. That was all based. The risk was so high that everything was on the table.
Yeah.
So you don't want to be in that position as an organization that you're at such high risk of organizational failure that you're running around willing to do everything. That willing to take chances, willing to take risks needs to be baked into the organization so it stays at a manageable level so that you're not trailing behind the industry leaders. You're out there maintaining pace with the Teslas and the SpaceXs and the Andurils of the world.
Yeah. I appreciate those thoughts and tips on how to really think about risk and why we need to embrace it, and as leaders our role in that. As I was thinking about this topic, another consideration that came to my mind that is helpful in embracing risk is understanding the importance of the way that we frame the issue. So earlier I mentioned um, Tversky and Kahneman's work, and they showed that how we receive and view data has a significant impact on how we interpret the risk of a given situation. So I mentioned this on a previous podcast when it comes to thinking about the risk of surgery or some other treatment. So if we frame the situation from the perspective of potential loss, such as you have a 10% risk of dying, then the tendency is to steer away from that risk, even though you may have 100% risk of dying if you don't have the procedure. You hear the 10% risk of dying and you focus on that. Whereas if we frame it from the other perspective and say the potential gain is that you have a 90% chance of surviving and thriving, then the tendency is to embrace the risk. Granted, most people aren't going to be analyzing those legitimately life and death risk when it comes to what they're doing, but whatever situation, if we as leaders are framing that risk as a learning opportunity or potential for achieving a particular goal rather than something to be avoided, we can unlock significant potential in not only ourselves but in those that we lead.
Yeah, I agree. I would simply say, where are you going to keep your resources under your mattress? If or you're not going to get out of bed in the morning because you're worried about getting hit by a bus. So sometimes it's useful to frame the discussion, any discussion, in this case, a risk discussion, in the extremes. Why is it that we are so risk adverse? And what's the danger of being all embracing of risk? We don't want to be stuntmen and women out there, but at the same time, we don't want to have a workforce that is afraid to get out of bed.
Right.
Somewhere in the middle is where we need to be. So I think that's very useful, the way you framed it in that context of extremes, the 10% to 90%.
Well, Admiral Swift, we've had a thorough conversation. It's really been great. Thank you so much, sir, for being on the Science of Leadership today. It's been an honor. I always enjoy getting to talk to you. You have a wonderful way of thinking about things and communicating those. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom. I really appreciate it. I'm honored to be part of what is a very distinguished group of folks you've had on your podcast. So it's been a real pleasure talking to you. I look forward to your book coming out soon.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.